the violent, rain-lashed service courtyard of Blackwood Manor, where Martina Frey stands exposed to the elements, the heavy oak door looming behind her. At barely 20 years old, she bears the physical weight of her pregnancy and the crushing weight of her sudden homelessness. Two stern footmen, men she once worked alongside, step forward not with concern but with force. They physically usher her toward the muddy gates, warning her that if she is found loitering on the grounds by morning, the constable will be summoned to take her to the workhouse. Despite the overwhelming power of the men and the storm, Martina digs her heels into the mud. She doesn't scream, but she refuses to vanish quietly into the night, her eyes scanning the darkness for any shelter to protect her unborn child. The atmosphere shifts when the perspective moves to the second floor. Above the chaos, framed by the warm amber glow of the library window, stands Elliot May, the Duke of Blackwood. He is the master of the estate, a figure of immense wealth and power, yet he stands perfectly still, separated from the violence below by a pane of glass. Known to the ton as the Mad Duke, or the recluse who detests society, he is feared by his own staff for his cold demeanor and absolute intolerance for disorder. As he watches the small, defiant figure of the pregnant maid resisting the storm and his servants, his grip tightens on his cane. He does not turn away in disgust as the housekeeper did. Instead, his expression hardens with a fierce, unexpected resolve. A silent decision that signals the end of her exile and the beginning of their story. The heavy service door of Blackwood Manor flew open, and the storm outside seemed to scream in anger. Rain slashed down in icy sheets, turning the cobblestones into a river of mud. Martina Frey stumbled backward, her boots slipping on the wet stones. She wasn't just walking out, she was being shoved. "Please, Mrs. Gable!" Martina cried out, her voice barely audible over the roaring thunder. She hugged her small bundle of clothes to her chest to keep them dry. "Just for tonight, the storm is too strong, I have nowhere to go." Mrs. Gable, the head housekeeper, stood in the dry, warm doorway like a statue made of stone. Her face was twisted with disgust. She didn't look at Martina like a person anymore. She looked at her like she was dirt on a fine rug. "I will not have a fallen woman under this roof," Mrs. Gable shouted, her voice sharp and cruel. "You have brought shame to this house. Lord Sterling has moved on, and so should you. We run a respectable home here, not a charity for girls who lose their virtue." Two footmen, men Martina had shared meals with just yesterday, stepped forward. They looked down, unable to meet her eyes, but they did their job. With a rough push, they forced her past the threshold and into the pouring rain. "Out," Mrs. Gable commanded. "If you are found on the grounds by morning, I will call the constable." The heavy wooden door slammed shut with a final booming thud. The sound of the lock clicking into place felt like a gunshot in the dark. Martina stood alone in the freezing downpour. The cold water soaked through her thin grey dress in seconds, chilling her to the bone. She took a step, but her legs were shaking too hard. She slipped in the mud and fell to her knees. The harsh gravel scraped her skin, but the pain in her heart hurt far more. She curled around her stomach, trying to shield her unborn baby from the biting wind. Tears mixed with the rain on her face. She had worked so hard, scrubbed so many floors, and believed so many pretty lies from a man who had promised her the world. Now she had nothing. No home, no money, and no hope. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the darkness, clutching her wet bundle tight against her heart. She squeezed her eyes shut, the mud seeping into her apron. She was just a maid in the dirt, and she was certain that this was the end of her story. The sound of heavy iron hinges groaning cut through the noise of the storm. Martina flinched, expecting the footman to return and drag her further away. But the sound didn't come from the service entrance. It came from the grand front doors of the manor. A flood of golden light spilled out onto the wet courtyard, cutting a path through the darkness. A tall figure appeared in the doorway. It was Elliot May, the Duke of Blackwood. He wasn't dressed for the weather. He wore a crisp white shirt and a dark vest, but no coat and no hat. The rain soaked him instantly, plastering his dark hair to his forehead, but he didn't seem to notice. He stepped off the dry porch and walked straight into the mud. Mrs. Gable gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Your Grace?" she squeaked, her voice trembling. "Sir, please, you must go back inside." The Duke didn't answer. He didn't even look at her. He walked with long, angry strides past the frozen footman, his eyes locked on Martina. Martina tried to shrink away, terrified. Everyone knew the Duke was a cold, scary man who hated being disturbed. She thought he had come to yell at her for making a scene on his property. She squeezed her eyes shut and braced herself for his anger, but the shouting never came. Instead, the rain stopped hitting her face. The Duke was standing over her, blocking the wind with his body. He knelt in the mud, ruining his fine trousers without a second thought. Before Martina could say a word, he reached out. His hands were large and warm as he slid them under her shoulders and knees. With a single, smooth motion, he lifted her out of the dirt and into his arms. Martina gasped, her dirty apron pressing against his clean shirt. "Your Grace," she whispered, "I'm getting you filthy." He ignored her, pulling her closer to his chest to shield her from the cold. He turned slowly to face the staff huddled by the service door. Mrs. Gable looked pale, her eyes wide with shock. "My lord," the housekeeper stammered, pointing a shaking finger at Martina. "You cannot bring her back in. She has broken the rules. We were just removing the stain on this family's reputation." Elliot's face was like stone. He stared at Mrs. Gable with eyes that looked sharper than glass. The courtyard went deadly silent, the only sound the drumming of the rain. "Mrs. Gable," Elliot said, his voice low but powerful enough to drown out the thunder. "In this house we do not discard people like refuse." He turned his back on them, leaving the stunned servants in the rain. Holding Martina tight, he carried her up the stone steps and through the open doors, taking her out of the storm and into the light. Martina blinked her eyes open, expecting the stinging cold of rain or the hard wooden floor of the workhouse. Instead, she felt something impossibly soft beneath her cheek. It felt like she was floating on a cloud. She sat up with a gasp, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't in the servants' attic. The room was enormous, larger than the entire cottage she grew up in. A fire crackled cheerfully in a marble fireplace, casting a warm orange glow over heavy velvet curtains and a polished mahogany wardrobe. Panic seized her throat. This was a guest suite, a room reserved for lords and ladies. She looked down and realized her soaked grey dress was gone. She was wearing a clean white nightgown made of fine linen. "Oh no," she whispered, her hands shaking. If Mrs. Gable found her here, ruining the master's fine sheets, she wouldn't just be fired, she would be arrested for trespassing. She had to leave. She had to get out before the constable came. Martina threw off the thick quilt and swung her legs over the side of the high bed. Her head spun dizzyingly, and the room tilted. She gripped the bedpost to keep from falling, her knuckles turning white. The heavy door handle turned. Martina froze, terror locking her muscles in place. The door opened, and the Duke walked in. He looked very different from the wild figure in the rain. He was dry now, dressed in a fresh, dark suit that made him look tall and imposing. In his hands, he carried a silver tray with a steaming porcelain cup. Martina's servant training took over instantly. She ignored the black spots dancing in her vision and tried to scramble to her feet to show respect. "Your Grace," she gasped, her voice raspy. "Forgive me. I didn't mean to intrusion. I don't know how I got here. Please, I'll leave right now." She tried to dip into a clumsy curtsy, but her knees were too weak. They buckled and she stumbled forward. The Duke set the tray down on a side table with a sharp clack. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, his face serious. "Stop," he commanded. The deep authority in his voice made her freeze halfway up. She looked at him with wide, fearful eyes. "I must show respect, sir. I am just a maid." Elliot stood over her, his shadow stretching across the bed. He didn't look angry, but he looked intense. He pointed a stern finger at the pillows. "You are not a maid in this room," he said firmly. "You are a guest under my protection, and in this room you do not bow to me." Martina hesitated, confused by the strange mix of sternness and kindness in his tone. "Lay back down," he ordered, his voice brooking no argument. "That is a command." Trembling, Martina sank back onto the soft mattress. She pulled the quilt up to her chin, watching him carefully. For the first time in her life, a master had given her an order that was meant to help her, not use her. By the next morning, Blackwood Manor was buzzing like a beehive that had been kicked over. The silence of the hallways was replaced by frantic whispers. Maids huddled in corners, their eyes wide as they exchanged the shocking news. The mad Duke had not only saved the disgraced maid, but he had also put her in the finest room in the house. Mrs. Gable, the head housekeeper, walked through the corridors with a face like thunder. She could not believe what was happening. She had run this house for 20 years with strict rules, and in one night the Duke had broken them all. She straightened her stiff black dress and marched straight to the library. She found Elliot sitting at his desk, staring out the window at the rain-washed gardens. He didn't turn around when she entered. "Your Grace," Mrs. Gable said, her voice shaking with self-righteous anger, "we need to speak about the girl." Elliot turned slowly in his chair. His face was calm, but his eyes were cold. "Her name is Martina, and she is resting." Mrs. Gable bristled. "This is a scandal, sir. The staff is talking. We cannot have a woman of her condition living here like a lady. It insults every honest worker in this house. I cannot run a household that has lost its morals." She took a deep breath and played her final card. "If she stays, I cannot. You must choose, Your Grace. Either the girl goes, or I resign." She lifted her chin, expecting him to beg her to stay. She was the one who kept the manor running after all. Elliot didn't even blink. He picked up a pen and dipped it in ink. "I accept your resignation, Mrs. Gable. You may collect your wages and leave by noon." Mrs. Gable's jaw dropped. She sputtered, trying to find words, but the Duke had already looked back down at his papers. He had chosen the fallen maid over his most loyal servant, without a second thought. Later that afternoon, Elliot returned to the guest suite. Martina was sitting up in bed, looking small and worried. She had heard the commotion in the hallway. "I caused trouble, didn't I?" she asked quietly, as he placed a tray of soup and warm bread on her lap. "Mrs. Gable is angry." "Mrs. Gable is no longer a concern of yours," Elliot said simply. He pulled a chair close to the bed, sitting much closer than a duke should sit to a former servant. "Your only job is to get your strength back." Martina looked at the food, tears pricking her eyes. "Why are you doing this? Everyone says I'm ruined." "Eat," Elliot urged gently, ignoring her question. He watched her lift the spoon, his cold expression softening just for a moment. He wouldn't let the world hurt her again, even if he had to fire every servant in the manor to keep her safe. The rain had turned into a soft drizzle, tapping gently against the window pane. Inside the guest suite, the only sound was the quiet clinking of silverware. Elliot had insisted on joining Martina for dinner, sitting in the velvet armchair near her bed while she ate from a tray. It was quiet, but it wasn't an awkward silence anymore. For the first time in months, Martina felt safe. Elliot watched her set down her fork. His face was serious, the flickering shadows from the fireplace hiding his eyes. "Martina," he said, his voice low and steady, "I need to know. Who is the father?" Martina froze. The warmth of the room seemed to vanish. She looked down at her hands, twisting the edge of the blanket until her fingers turned white. "It doesn't matter, Your Grace," she whispered. "He doesn't want us. He made that very clear." "It matters to me," Elliot replied gently. "If I am to protect you, I need to know the truth." Martina took a shaky breath, fighting back the shame that always rose in her throat. It was Viscount Sterling. The name hung in the air like thick smoke. Martina continued, her voice trembling as the memories came rushing back. "I was a maid at his estate before I came to Blackwood. He was kind to me. He brought me flowers from the garden. He told me that he didn't care about rules or titles. He promised we would run away together." A single tear slid down her cheek, but when I told him about the baby, he laughed. He looked at me like I was a stranger. He said a viscount could never marry a servant. He had me thrown out that very night without a penny. Elliot didn't yell. He didn't throw anything, but his hand gripped the armrest of his chair so hard his knuckles turned white. The air in the room seemed to grow heavy with his silent anger. "Sterling," Elliot whispered, the name sounding like a curse word. He stood up abruptly and walked to the fireplace, staring deep into the orange flames. "I know what they say about me," Elliot said, his back to her. "They call me the Mad Duke. They say I hide in this house because I'm crazy." He turned around, and his eyes burned with an intensity that startled her. "I hide because of men like Sterling," Elliot revealed, his voice thick with disgust. "I grew up watching the Toon. I watched them lie, cheat, and destroy people without a second thought, all while wearing fine silk and smiling at parties. They are wolves dressed as sheep. They think a title makes them better than everyone else." He walked back to the bed, his expression softening as he looked at her. "You think you are ruined because you trusted a liar, but you are not the one who should be ashamed, Martina. He is." "But I was foolish," she whispered, wiping her eyes. "No," Elliot said firmly. "You were trusting. There is a difference." He stood tall, casting a protective shadow over her. "You are safe here. Sterling is a small, cruel man, and he will never touch you or this child again. I promise you that." The bitter cold of winter slowly melted away, replaced by the pale light of spring. As the months passed, Martina's stomach grew round and heavy with life. Most women in her position would have stayed hidden in their rooms, ashamed to be seen. But Martina was not used to being idle. She had worked since she was a child, and sitting still felt unnatural to her. One quiet afternoon, she wandered into the library. It was Elliot's sanctuary, a massive room filled with the smell of old paper and leather. Dust motes danced in the sunlight, and piles of books were scattered everywhere on tables and chairs. The Duke might have been a brilliant man, but he was terribly disorganized. Martina sighed softly and got to work. She couldn't lift the heavy boxes, but she could tidy the shelves. She moved slowly, her hand resting on her belly, as she sorted the volumes by author and subject. She was so focused that she didn't hear Elliot enter. "You should be resting," his deep voice rumbled from the doorway. Martina jumped, nearly dropping a book of poetry. She turned to face him, her cheeks flushing pink. "I cannot sit in that bed for another hour, Your Grace. I feel useless. Please, let me be helpful." Elliot walked into the room, leaning on his cane. He looked at the neat stacks she had created. He picked up the book she was holding, a collection of complex history essays. "You are organizing them by era," he observed, sounding surprised. "Most servants would have just sorted them by size or color." Martina stood tall, despite the ache in her lower back. "My father was a schoolteacher before he fell ill," she explained quietly. "He taught me to read and write. He said a mind is a terrible thing to waste, even for a girl. Elliot looked at her, really looked at her. For months he had seen her as a fragile thing that needed protecting. But now, seeing her surrounded by his books, discussing history with a spark in her eyes, he saw something else. He saw an equal. "Sit," Elliot said, but this time it wasn't an order. It was an invitation. He pulled out a chair for her. "Since you are so determined to work, you can help me catalogue the new arrivals. My handwriting is terrible, and yours, I suspect, is quite neat." They spent the rest of the afternoon working in comfortable silence. Occasionally, Elliot would read a passage aloud, and Martina would offer a thoughtful opinion. She wasn't afraid of his intelligence, and he didn't look down on her status. Elliot watched her as she wrote in the ledger, a stray curl falling over her face. He admired how she carried her burden without complaining. She was quiet, but she was made of iron. In a world of loud, shallow people, he realized he was falling in love with her silence. Dr. Aris arrived at Blackwood Manor with a black leather bag and a nose that seemed to sniff for trouble. He was the only doctor in the village, and he was known for two things: his medical skill and his loose tongue. He examined Martina in the guest suite, listening to the baby's heartbeat with a cold, professional frown. Martina lay still, feeling small under his judgmental gaze. He didn't ask how she was feeling or offer a kind word. He just did his job and packed his tools away quickly. "The child is healthy," Dr. Aris said stiffly, wiping his hands on a cloth as if he had touched something dirty. He glanced around the luxurious room, taking in the velvet curtains and the vase of fresh flowers on the nightstand. "Though I must say, it is unusual to see such accommodations for a patient of your station." He left without a bow. By noon, Dr. Aris was in the village square, and by evening the entire town was buzzing with the news. The whispers spread like wildfire through dry grass. "Have you heard?" the baker's wife whispered to the seamstress. "The mad duke has finally lost his mind completely. He is keeping a fallen woman in the manor. He treats a pregnant maid like a duchess." The villagers shook their heads in disgust. They had always feared Elliot because he was quiet and different, but now they felt righteous anger. They believed he was mocking their values. 2 days later, the mail arrived at the manor. Usually Elliot received bills or dull invitations to parties he never attended. But today the tray was heavy with envelopes that looked different. Elliot sat at his desk and sliced open the first one. It wasn't a bill. It was a hateful scrawl of ink. "You are a disgrace to your title," the letter read. "To harbor a woman of loose morals is a stain on our community. Send her to the workhouse where she belongs, or we will not remain silent." Elliot's jaw tightened. He opened the next one. It was even worse, full of cruel names for Martina and threats against the unborn child. The town and the village were united in their hatred. Suddenly, the library door creaked open. Elliot moved with lightning speed. He crumpled the hateful letters in his fist and shoved them deep into his desk drawer, slamming it shut just as Martina waddled into the room. She looked brighter today, her cheeks pink. "Is everything all right, Elliot?" she asked, noticing his tense shoulders. "You look upset." Elliot forced his hands to unclench. He took a deep breath and turned to her with a gentle, protective smile. "It is nothing," he lied smoothly. "Just boring business matters. Nothing for you to worry about." He walked over and offered her his arm, guiding her away from the desk. He would let the town scream and write their poison. He would take every blow himself, as long as Martina never had to read a single cruel word. The wind howled outside Blackwood Manor, rattling the window panes in their frames. It sounded exactly like the night Martina had been thrown out into the mud months ago. But this time she wasn't freezing in the dark. She was burning up with fever and pain. A sharp cramp ripped through her stomach, making her body arch off the mattress. Martina cried out, gripping the silk sheets until her knuckles turned white. "The baby," she gasped, her breath coming in short, panicked puffs. "It's time." The heavy door to the suite burst open. It wasn't a servant who ran in first. It was Elliot. He had been pacing in the hallway for hours, refusing to go to sleep while the storm raged. He rushed to her side, his face pale with worry. "I am here," he said, his voice steady even though his eyes were full of fear. The midwife, a stern woman from the village, looked up from the foot of the bed. She frowned deeply. "Your Grace, you must leave immediately. The birthing room is no place for a man, especially a duke. It is highly improper." "I am not leaving," Elliot growled. He didn't care about the rules of the ton. He didn't care that gentlemen were supposed to wait in the library with a glass of brandy while women suffered alone upstairs. Martina let out another scream as a new wave of pain hit her harder than the last. "Elliot," she sobbed, reaching out blindly. "I'm scared. It hurts too much." The labor was long and difficult. The baby was struggling to enter the world, and Martina's strength was fading fast. She felt like she was slipping away into the darkness. "Look at me," Elliot commanded softly. He took her sweating hand in his, interlacing their fingers tight. He ignored the midwife's shocked gasps. He sat right on the edge of the bed and leaned close, becoming her only focus. "You are the strongest person I know, Martina," he whispered. "You survived the storm. You survived the world turning its back on you. You can do this." His voice was her anchor. Every time she felt like giving up, she squeezed his hand, and he squeezed back just as hard. He wiped the damp hair from her forehead with a tenderness that shocked the servants in the room. Hours passed. The candles burned low. Finally, just as a crack of thunder shook the house, a new sound filled the room. It was a loud, angry cry. The midwife worked quickly, wrapping a small, wriggling bundle in a warm blanket. Her stern face melted into a smile. "It is a boy," she announced. "A strong, healthy boy." Martina collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted but smiling through her tears. Elliot looked at the baby, then back at Martina. He didn't pull his hand away. In that room, surrounded by pain and new life, the Duke looked at the maid with open adoration. They had brought a life into the world together, and the bond between them was now unbreakable. Peace returned to the manor for only 3 days before the world came crashing back in. Martina was sitting in the sunny drawing room, rocking her newborn son, Leo, in her arms. She finally felt safe. But then, the heavy doors swung open, and the butler announced a guest with a trembling voice. "Viscount Sterling." The blood drained from Martina's face. She pulled the baby tight against her chest as a man strode into the room. He was handsome in a cruel way, dressed in expensive silk, tapping a riding crop against his leg. He didn't look at Martina's face. His greedy eyes went straight to the bundle in her arms. "So the rumors are true," Sterling sneered, a twisted smile playing on his lips. "My little maid found herself a bigger house, and I hear there is a son. My son." Martina shook her head, tears of fear springing to her eyes. "You said you didn't want him. You threw me out." "That was before I knew the Duke of Blackwood was involved," Sterling laughed coldly. He took a step forward, reaching out a hand as if to snatch the baby. "If a duke cares for the boy, he must be worth something. I've come to collect my property. I have a legal right to my heir." Before his fingers could touch the blanket, a black cane slammed down onto the floorboards with a crack like a gunshot. Elliot stepped out from the shadows of the bookshelf. He didn't yell, but the air in the room instantly turned freezing cold. He moved between Martina and the Viscount, his broad shoulders forming a wall of protection. "You have no rights here, Sterling," Elliot said, his voice dangerously low. Sterling puffed out his chest, trying to look important. "I am the father. The law is on my side. I can take the child, and there is nothing you can do about it." "Actually," Elliot interrupted, pulling a folded document from his coat pocket, "there is everything I can do." He snapped the paper open. "This is a petition of guardianship. It includes signed witness statements from my staff and yours, testifying that you knowingly abandoned a pregnant woman to starve in a storm. In the eyes of the law, that is not fatherhood, that is criminal neglect." Sterling's face turned pale. He sputtered, You wouldn't dare take this to court. The scandal." "I am the Duke of Blackwood," Elliot said, taking a menacing step forward. "I do not fear scandal, but you should. If you do not walk out that door right now, I will have this document published in every newspaper in London. Everyone will know you are a man who discards his own blood to save a few coins." Elliot leaned in close, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "You treated them like trash. Now, you will leave my house before I have you thrown out like the garbage you are." Sterling looked from the document to Elliot's furious eyes. He realized he had lost. With a noise of frustration, he spun on his heel and fled the room, defeated. Elliot turned back to Martina, his scary expression melting away instantly. "He is gone," he promised, gently touching the baby's head. "He will never come back." The silence in the drawing room felt heavy, but it was a good kind of heavy, like a deep breath after a long run. Viscount Sterling was gone, and the threat that had hung over Martina's head for so long had vanished with him. She looked down at baby Leo, who was sleeping peacefully, completely unaware of the battle that had just been fought for him. Martina looked up at Elliot, her eyes swimming with tears. "You risked everything," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Your reputation, your standing in society, you threw it all away for a maid." Elliot walked over to her, his movements slow and deliberate. He shook his head gently. "I did not save you because you were a maid, Martina, and I certainly did not save you out of pity." He reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, his touch sending a warm shiver through her. "That night in the storm," Elliot confessed, his voice soft, "I watched from the window. I saw a woman facing the worst moment of her life. You were cold, alone, and terrified, but you stood tall. You refused to break. In a world full of people who only care about appearances, I saw your soul. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen." Martina's breath caught in her throat. She had always thought he saved her because he was kind. She never realized he admired her. Elliot took a deep breath and lowered himself onto one knee. It was the same way he had knelt in the mud months ago, but this time the floor was clean and the future was bright. He took her free hand in his. "I have spent my life hiding in this house, hating the world outside," he said, "but you brought light into these dark halls. You and Leo are my family. I don't want to protect you as a guest anymore. I want to love you as my wife." He looked deep into her eyes. "Martina Frey, will you do me the honor of becoming the Duchess of Blackwood?" Tears spilled over her cheeks, but they were tears of pure joy. "Yes," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "Yes, Elliot." Weeks later, the gardens of Blackwood Manor were in full bloom. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, a perfect contrast to the grey, stormy night that had started it all. The mud was gone, replaced by lush green grass and colourful flowers. Elliot sat on a stone bench in the sun, with Martina beside him. She wasn't wearing a servant's grey dress anymore. She wore a gown of soft blue silk. In her arms, Leo cooed and reached for the sunlight with tiny fingers. Elliot wrapped his arm around his wife's shoulders, pulling her close. Martina rested her head against him, closing her eyes and listening to the birds sing. They didn't care about the whispers of the town or the rules of the ton. They had found each other in the rain, but now, They were standing in the sun. They were safe, they were loved, and finally they were a family.